In January 2012, a team of forensic anthropologists walked into a wooded lot behind a shuttered Florida reform school, carrying ground penetrating radar instead of shovels. The state's own paperwork said 31 boys had died there and been buried on the property. What the radar found underneath those pine trees didn't match that number. Not close. The University of South Florida authorized the investigation. Dr. Erin Kimmerle led it. Her team was working from something specific, a set of survivor accounts, first published quietly online in the mid-2000s, then corroborated independently by dozens of other men who hadn't spoken to each other in 50 years, and a single official state document, the school's own burial log. That was about to be tested against the ground itself for the first time in over a century. Here's what should stop you. The surprising part isn't that a reform school in Florida had a difficult history. Institutions like this existed across the country. What shocked the forensic team was the gap between what the paperwork claimed and what the radar signals actually showed beneath undisturbed soil that no one had touched in decades. So why did it take until 2012 for anyone to look? Why did a 2009 state investigation close without a single shovel going into the ground? What happened to the boys whose names never made it into that official log at all? Why did survivors wait 60 years to compare notes with each other? What did the original 1900s admission records actually say about who these boys were and why they'd been sent there in the first place? What did the school tell the families who asked? And why, in 2017, did the state of Florida feel it had no choice left but to formally apologize? The forensic reports exist. The state investigation exists. The survivor testimonies exist, filed, cross-referenced, and independently corroborated. What doesn't exist yet is a complete answer to the one question this documentary is built to chase. How does a state lose track of its own dead for over 100 years with the paperwork sitting in its own archive the entire time? Today we're opening that paperwork, following the evidence exactly where it leads. The Florida State Reform School opened its doors in Marianna in January 1900, established by the state legislature as an alternative to sending juvenile offenders directly into adult prisons. On paper, that was a genuine reform, a recognition that children shouldn't be incarcerated alongside adult convicts, and an attempt to build something closer to a residential institution focused on discipline and vocational training. In practice, the boys sent to Marianna over the following century came from an extraordinarily broad range of circumstances. Some had committed serious offences. Many more were committed for what would today be considered minor juvenile matters, or no crime at all, repeated truancy, running away, being deemed unmanageable by a parent, or in a number of documented cases, simply being an orphan with nowhere else for the state to place them. Commitment could come from a judge, but in Florida's system at the time, it could also come through more informal channels, with limited due process protections for the children involved. The school operated under Jim Crow segregation for the majority of its history. Black and white boys were housed in entirely separate facilities on the same grounds, a structural division that persisted until Florida's broader school desegregation efforts finally reached the institution in 1968, nearly a decade after Brown v. Board of Education, and only after sustained external pressure. Conditions in the segregated black boys' facility, according to survivor accounts and later investigative findings, were consistently documented as more severe than conditions in the white facility, though harsh discipline was reported across both. The most consistent and, over time, best documented element of life at the school was corporal punishment administered in a small white cottage on the property that boys who passed through it came to call, simply, the White House. Survivors across multiple decades independently described being taken to that building for beatings administered with a leather strap awaited. Multi-layered belts some survivors nicknamed Black Beauty for infractions that ranged from serious to, by their own accounts, essentially nothing at all. The consistency of these independent accounts, given by men who in many cases had no contact with one another for 50 or 60 years after leaving the school, is one of the central pieces of evidence that later investigators treated as credible corroboration rather than isolated allegation. For most of the 20th century, none of this reached the public in any sustained way. Boys who left the school went home, grew up, and in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, said nothing publicly for decades. What eventually broke that silence wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a group of aging men starting to compare notes with each other for the first time in half a century. The White House Boys in the mid-2000s. A former Dozier student named Roger Dean Kaiser began publishing an account of his time at the school in the early 1960s on the internet, one of the earliest public first-person descriptions of the beatings and conditions he said he experienced there as a boy. That account began circulating among other former students, many of whom had never spoken publicly, and in some documented cases had never told even their own families about what had happened to them decades earlier. By 2008, a loose network of these former students had organized under a name that referenced the building at the center of their shared accounts, the White House Boys. What started as informal contact between individual survivors grew into an organized effort to bring public and official attention to the school's history survivors, giving public testimony, contacting journalists, and eventually petitioning the state of Florida directly to investigate what they said had happened on the property, including allegations that some boys had died from abuse or from unexplained causes and been buried on site without proper documentation or notification to their families. The accounts these men gave, independently and often for the first time in 50 or 60 years, described patterns that were remarkably consistent across different decades of attendance at the school, different superintendents, different eras, similar core allegations about the White House building, about disappearances of specific boys that were never adequately explained to fellow students at the time, and about a small cemetery on the property, sometimes referred to informally as Boot Hill, where the school's own records acknowledged some number of burials had taken place over the decades. This is the point where the story moves from individual testimony, which, however consistent, remained difficult to independently verify on its own, into something that could be tested against physical evidence. Because if boys had in fact been buried on that property in numbers or under circumstances the school's paperwork didn't fully account for, that would be a claim the ground itself could potentially confirm or fail to confirm decades later, regardless of what any surviving written record said. In 2009, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement opened a formal investigation into the survivors' allegations. Investigators reviewed what surviving records existed, interviewed survivors, and ultimately identified 31 names in the school's own official burial records for the Boot Hill Cemetery. That state investigation closed without criminal charges. It also didn't include a physical excavation of the site, which meant the number 31 remained, for the moment, a figure based entirely on paperwork the school itself had generated decades earlier. Under conditions nobody outside the institution had ever independently verified. What the ground showed in 2012, Dr. Erin Kimmerle, a forensic anthropologist at the University of South Florida, secured permission and funding to conduct an independent scientific investigation of the Boot Hill Cemetery site, the first time the ground itself, rather than the school's surviving paperwork, would be directly examined. The team's initial phase used ground-penetrating radar to scan the wooded lot without disturbing the soil, searching for the kind of subsurface anomalies consistent with unmarked burial sites, disturbed soil patterns, changes in density, and other signatures that trained forensic teams used to distinguish grave shafts from natural ground variation. The results were significant. The radar survey identified signals consistent with a substantially higher number of potential burial sites than the 31 names in the school's own official records findings that, while requiring excavation to fully confirm, immediately called into question whether the existing paperwork represented a complete accounting of who had been buried on the property. Over the following 2 years, the USF team conducted a phased excavation, working with the same rigour and legal protocols used in any modern forensic investigation involving human remains. They recovered skeletal remains from multiple burial sites across the property, in a number of cases finding remains in locations that had no corresponding marker or documented record at all, and in other cases finding evidence suggesting that a single marked or documented grave location actually contained more than one individual, complicating the school's own historical count even further. Where possible, the team worked to identify recovered remains through forensic analysis and DNA comparison with the families of boys long presumed by their relatives to have simply died and been properly buried at the institution. Decades earlier families, who in some documented cases had never received an official death certificate, cause of death, or any explanation beyond being told their child had died at the school. Successfully identified remains were, in several cases, returned to surviving family members for a burial closer to home, sometimes more than 80 years after the death itself. The investigation's official findings, published in the years following the excavation, documented a total number of recovered burial sites meaningfully higher than the 31 names the state's own 2009 records had listed. Physical, scientific confirmation that the paperwork the institution had generated about its own history was, at minimum, incomplete. The exact final total and the precise causes of death for a number of the individuals recovered remain subjects that researchers describe as only partially resolved even today, given how much documentation from the school's early decades was lost, never created, or destroyed over the course of more than a century of operation. The excavation gave survivors something no amount of testimony alone had been able to produce for 60 years: physical, forensic confirmation that their accounts of a hidden burial gap were not simply personal recollection, but measurable fact. What it still couldn't fully answer was the question every one of those survivors had been asking since the 1960s: what, exactly, had the state of Florida known, and when? The school's final decade's A&D closure, the Dozier School for Boys, continued operating for decades after the earliest White House Boys era of attendance, through multiple changes in superintendent, name, and official oversight structure, before finally closing in June 2011. The stated official reason for closure was budget constraints during a period of statewide fiscal cuts to Florida's juvenile justice system, a bureaucratic explanation that arrived, notably, in the same broader period when survivor advocacy and early media attention to the White House Boys allegations were beginning to generate sustained public pressure. The timing here matters for understanding how institutional accountability actually unfolded in this case. The school did not close because of a definitive government finding of historical abuse or wrongful deaths. The formal state investigation that could have produced such a finding had already closed in 2009 without criminal charges. It closed for stated budgetary reasons, 2 years before the University of South Florida's forensic excavation would begin producing physical evidence that directly contradicted the completeness of the state's own prior investigation. That sequenced survivor testimony beginning in 2008, a state investigation closing without charges in 2009. The school itself closing for unrelated stated reasons in 2011, and independent forensic scientists only then beginning to excavate physical evidence in 2012, is itself part of the documented record here, and it's worth sitting with directly. The institution most directly implicated in the survivors' allegations was permanently shut down, and its site preserved largely by chance of timing, not as a direct consequence of the investigation into what had happened there. In the years following the USF excavation's findings, survivor advocacy continued at the state level, culminating in April 2017 when the Florida legislature passed, and Governor Rick Scott signed, a formal resolution offering the state's official apology to the survivors of abuse at the Dozier School and its sister facility, the Okeechobee School for Boys, a document that acknowledged. In the state's own official language, that abuse had occurred at the institutions and that the state bore responsibility for it more than a century after the school first opened and nearly a decade after survivors had first organized to demand exactly that acknowledgement. A formal apology and an accounting of the dead are two different things, and by the state's own admission. The second one still isn't complete. Some recovered remains more than a decade after excavation began have never been identified. Some families are still waiting. What's still unresolved more than a decade after the University of South Florida's forensic team first walked the grounds with radar equipment, the full accounting of who died at the Dozier School for Boys and how. Remains incomplete, not because of an active cover-up still ongoing today, but because of how much documentation was never properly created or preserved during the century the school operated, particularly during its earliest and least scrutinized decades. Researchers involved in the identification effort have been candid about the limits of what forensic science can still recover. Skeletal remains alone often can't establish a definitive cause of death for individuals buried many decades ago, particularly without contemporaneous medical records that, for a significant number of the recovered individuals, appear never to have existed in any complete form to begin with. DNA identification depends on living relatives being findable and willing to provide comparison samples, which for boys who died at the institution generations ago, sometimes with no surviving close family, isn't always possible. What is fully resolved and independently corroborated across survivor testimony, state investigation, forensic excavation, and the state's own 2017 formal apology is the basic shape of the story, an institution operated for over a century with minimal external oversight, produced official records that a scientific excavation later proved to be incomplete, and only began to face any form of public reckoning after a group of aging survivors chose, after decades of individual silence, to start talking to each other. The property itself, now formally recognized as the Dozier School for Boys Cemetery, has since been the subject of ongoing preservation and memorial efforts, intended to ensure that whatever remains unresolved about specific names and specific causes of death, the site itself, and the fact that it required independent forensic science, not the institution's own records. To reveal its true scope isn't allowed to disappear from the historical record a second time. What makes the story of the Dozier School for Boys difficult to place in a single category is that no part of it required exaggeration to be alarming. The official state investigation found 31 names. Independent forensic science found meaningfully more graves than that. A formal government apology, arriving in 2017, confirmed in the state's own language that the survivors describing abuse for the better part of a decade had been telling the truth. Every escalation in this story came from evidence catching up to testimony that had already been given, not the other way around. The gap between what an institution's own paperwork says happened and what a forensic excavation can independently confirm is, in some sense, the same gap this entire channel exists to investigate, just made unusually literal here, measured directly in unmarked graves rather than missing documents or mislabeled causes of death. It took the White House boys the better part of 60 years to be believed. It's worth asking what other institutional records from other decades and other states are still sitting exactly where Dozier's sat for a century, unquestioned, simply because nobody with the standing to dig has done it yet. If you want to look into the primary sources yourself, the University of South Florida Forensic Investigations published findings, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's 2009 report, and the text of the state's 2017 formal apology, I've linked what's publicly available in the description. This is recent, documented, and still actively being resolved. It didn't need a single embellishment to earn its place in this channel's archive.